So we are going to talk about kids' gut health today. I know we've been talking about a lot of adult health issues, so we wanted to bring kids gut health, kids issues as well. So we have Sandi Ross in our studio today. She is from Australia. She is a lecturer at one of the leading natural health university in Australia. She specializes in nutrition, naturopathy, and acupuncture with special focus on women's and kids' health. Welcome, Sandi.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So let's just focus on, we have heard so much research on gut and brain connection. So we want to focus on kids' gut health, right? It needs to start sooner than later on we find that we have all these issues. So let's just talk about how can kids have a proper gut health? I mean, what are the steps?
Yeah, okay. So one thing I do notice a lot is gut problems kind of arise from when foods are introduced at a young age, around 6 months of age. And this can come from, I guess, incorrect foods or, just maybe trying to feed our children in a way that is done a little bit, probably we could guide it a little bit better, if that makes sense. Yeah. So with children, they actually have very underdeveloped organs, right? So they don't produce the stomach acid like we produce. They don't produce as much pancreatic enzymes. So their digestive systems are underfunctioning compared to adults. So the way we introduce food really needs to be gentle and soft, and we need to use the right foods to do so. So I see a lot of gut issues start to arise from around that 6 months of age. In Chinese medicine, we actually talk a lot about food stagnation. So like kids aren't able to digest their food and then it stagnates. And then that causes conditions in the body such as heat. Heat can manifest as, eczema, atopic conditions, behavioral disorders, sleep disturbances, ADHD, so on and so forth. So a lot of problems in children, young children in particular, arise from food stagnation, from not having great digestive function. And so how we can support that is really guiding with the correct nutrition and the way of eating, in a really relaxed environment, no forcing our children to eat, not eating when they're anxious or feeling stressed. It's really important to support gut health in children. And this is young children I'm talking about, infants and toddlers. When we get into the, 3 to 5 year old kids, we do start to see other things like parasites and threadworms come into the gut health picture quite a bit. And that's where we can use things like probiotics and specific nutrients to really support what's going on in their little guts. But food really is interrelatable when it comes to children's health with the gut.
So now 6 months is very young. I mean, they're babies, right? Yeah. And most of the women at that time, they're probably breastfeeding. So do you think there's a correlation with some women who don't breastfeed their kids and they're starting with, one of those formulas, the one in the jar? Is there some kind of a correlation to gut health issues?
Yeah, I think it starts a little bit more beyond that even, to be honest, back in pregnancy, really. So if you've got a depleted mother or a mother that's really stressed and rushed and busy, she might then have a difficult labor. She might need interventions, medications, potentially even a C-section. We know babies that are born through C-section are not going to have the inoculation of all those good microbes that they get when they come through the birth canal, the vagina. So that's already setting them up to have kind of a different microbiome to the babies that are born through the vagina. And then we also know a correlation between like C-section born babies and the connection with breastfeeding. There's the biggest struggle there because they don't have those, juices and stuff and the hormones to really tell them it's breastfeeding connection time. And there's lots of studies done on this. So I think a lot of it can start around that age. And then if you've got a C-section born baby that hasn't potentially breastfed and they had to go into formula, then they are missing out on, those wonderful natural oligosaccharides and bacteria that you do get from the breast milk. So there can definitely be like a start with that already to the gut health connection. And there are really good studies now to show that if you can give a C-section born baby either the vaginal juices from the mother, so it's called seeding or vaginal swabbing. You kind of get the juices. It sounds very disgusting, but you swab the baby with all those juices.
How do you do this vaginal thing? That's kind of like, oh my God, I've never heard of this.
Yeah, so basically you keep a pad ideally in the underpants of the labouring mother until she takes them off, basically. And you get those juices and you swab the baby's mouth and around the face.
Mm-hmm.
Some obstetricians are very opposing to this and some are really on board. Midwives are very on board. So this is something you can discuss in your birth plan, leading into your pregnancy and labour. Alternatively, if you don't swab yourself, you can actually introduce specific bacteria. So bifidobacteriums are very important to introduce in the first 72 hours of life. So you just put a little bit in the baby's mouth. And that has actually been studied to show if you can introduce those microbes, those good bacteria within that first 72 hours of life, the baby can go on to develop as healthy microbiome as a vaginal born baby, which is really big and great news. And then obviously if baby's having to be formula fed, you can introduce those good bifidobacteriums into the formula as well, because unfortunately a lot of these are bacteria, they don't have a good shelf life, so they need to be kept refrigerated. They actually really need to be studied to make sure they're live. So if you are getting a formula and it says it's got beneficial bacteria, it may, but it may not have as many. It may not have the right component or the composition. So it is a good idea to, speak with a healthcare practitioner locally to you to try and find out what you can add to your baby's formula to really support that, first 6 months of life, because that is when baby's building its gut health. That is, they're born with no defense at birth. And in that first 6 months of life, that is when they're really building up their immunity and their gut health. And it's so important to make sure everything's coming in the right ratios and the right amounts. And obviously breastfeeding is the best way. If you can breastfeed, it is the best thing you can give to your baby. But I know in some circumstances women have trouble with it and they have to go on the formula. But yeah, so I would definitely advise breastfeeding is best. And if not, you can always introduce those microbes.
Wow. There's a lot of studies, like you said, have been done, obviously, correlation of breast milk to better immune health. So later on, let's move a little bit, not the 6 months, but a little toddler, next step, when they start walking a little. So what kind of foods? Is this different, particular type of foods that moms should introduce at that time?
Yeah, so I actually did a live forum yesterday on this kind of topic, and I was saying, even I've got a 3 and a 5-year-old, and what I introduced to them I probably wouldn't do now because of the studies that I look at and the research that's kind of changed around the microbiome and fiber. So years ago, I don't know how it was in the States, but in Australia we were kind of all fed Farrex, which is a rice kind of congee porridge with fortified things in it, which I wouldn't ideally recommend, but now I kind of can understand the concept of the fibers and the importance of fiber in the gut and how that feeds our gut bacteria. Rice porridge is probably not the worst thing, to be honest. It's just the added things that we don't want to have in there. So I gave my children avocado. Now I'd probably give them something with more starches in it, to be honest. So we want to and I will get to toddler's age. I'm just trying to give you the concept of how to get there. So what I'm getting at is fibers are very important for these 6 months to 2 years of age children, because that's when they're actually developing their microbiome. And so fibers are things like starches. So all your rice, your oats, your breads, your whole grains, and all your root vegetables are going to be really great sources of these fibers that then actually feed your gut bacteria. So we kind of don't need to focus on trying to make our kids eat a broccoli or anything green or have smoothies or anything like that. We need to give them these carbohydrates, which is great because that's what kids generally like. So are you Indian background?
Yeah, I am.
So you would have done dal and rice sort of thing. So that's perfect for your culture. And I think root vegetables is a great thing to be giving lots of kids, and that's something they can play with. Oatmeal, rice, or congees, they're fantastic foods to be giving toddlers and stuff. And it's something that they can feed themselves as well. You can make up nice, breads and stuff like that. And these are perfect foods. So lots of fiber for these young children is really important for their gut health.
Wow. Okay. And then moving after that, like when they grow up to be like 1 or 2 years, is there a different type of food or the same kind of continue?
Yeah. So 1 or 2 years, same sort of thing. Lots of fibers, and obviously meat is, meat is good, and eggs, and they need the iron because iron nutrients really do start to increase. So making sure they are getting forms of iron, but you get a lot of the B vitamins and zinc and all your core nutrients that you require in those whole grains and starches. So what a good idea is everyone should be eating the same thing. Once your child's about, 18 months old, you can be blending up dinner in a blender, or, they'll be eating chunks by 18 months, sorry. But, in the younger years and the younger months, you can just blend up your dinner and offer the same sort of thing. So you can do I'm not sure what you eat, but meat and 3 veg sort of thing can just go into a blender, and that can be offered to the younger kids, or you can just chop it up into little pieces for the toddlers. So, they can really, once they've got their teeth, they can start to eat as much as what we are eating. We just want to have really good quality versions of the food. So when we are eating things like gluten, we don't want white crappy bread that's got GMO grains in it, and it's just puffed out and there's no fermentation to it. We want good sourdough breads. We want whole grains. We want them from organic sources if we can. Things like corn, your rice and all those kind of things are going to be really good. So, I hope that answers your question without babbling on a little bit too much there. But it's really important to give your kids a diet that's very wide and varied in lots of foods, because the more foods you can introduce to your children, the more of those beneficial bacteria they grow.
And what about fermented foods, which are supposed to be very good for our gut health? Can you introduce that to the kids as well?
Yeah, so I would keep it to a small amount, though, in the beginning. For things like curd, yogurt are going to be great. There is some correlations with foods that are fermented because they're quite high in histamines, an amino acid called histamine. Now, you might know histamine from when you have an allergic reaction, you take an antihistamine. So we do see correlations with things like allergies and intolerances and things like eczema and atopic conditions with foods that are high in histamine. So they can be fermented foods. So we take those fermented foods because we're thinking we're getting the bacteria in those foods. Now, what we need to understand is it's important to have a little bit of them, but the fiber is what feeds those good bacteria. So if you don't have the fiber coming in the diet, there's no fuel source for those bacteria in your gut. So that's why I keep babbling on about the fiber. Fiber is very important as it feeds those good bacteria in your gut. So rather than trying to constantly eat those bacteria, just feed the ones in your gut so they can grow more.
Wow. Okay. So there are a lot of at least what I've read, like so many kids now have ADHD, autism, and this is not an autism and ADHD topic. But I was reading on the research that there is a lot of research that talks about the gut health, correct correlation of gut health to kids who have ADHD or autism as well, for that matter, right? I mean that's
so there's particular bacteria is found in the guts of little babies that have, or children, toddlers that have autism. And there's specific probiotics we actually don't use in children with autism, and ADHD definitely. Now, we know there's a lot of research around the gut-brain axis and how there's a big correlation between the health of the gut and the health of the brain. So it's definitely an important area to look at. I do work with those particular kids a lot with food intolerances and taking certain food groups out of the diet. I'm not an advocate for removing things like bread and dairy if it's unnecessary, but I do notice a huge improvement in children with ADHD or autism when they don't have things like gluten and dairy. Or, if it's very restrictive and hard for the parent, we might do a food intolerance test just so there's a bit more ease at the, in the kitchen and what to cook with. And another thing with those two is the genes that we test for. So there are some genes that are associated, with autism and ADHD that you can actually work with a healthcare practitioner to have your genes tested. Dr. Ben Lynch talks a lot about that from Seeking Health, and you can do a questionnaire to sort of find out what genes might not be working as good as some other genes. And that's a great starting point. And diet has a really big place with supporting your genes.
Yes. Okay, well, this is really good. I mean, informational gut health needs to start at a young age, before the birth. To your point, right?
Yes, definitely. This is a missing link.
And the thing is, I was reading one of the research that they said the unborn babies, when they're born, actually the babies, when they're born, so many in the United States, some of the babies they looked at, they were born with like 120 toxins, in the blood.
Yeah, I think it's actually 200 found in the cord blood. Yeah, it's a big number. So kids are already being born really exposed to a lot more chemicals than what we were. And so this is where it's really important to make sure that they have good gut health, because there's a big role of detoxification within the gut and all that. And then it's also going to prevent whatever goes to the brain. So babies have a leaky gut and they have a leaky brain up until the age of around 2 years old. And the reason is so that they can absorb as many nutrients as possible, because the idea is they're supposed to be growing, right? So we want them to be able to absorb as much as possible. So leaky gut and then a leaky brain to try and get everything into the brain, into the gut. Unfortunately, though, If you live in a very highly exposed with lots of chemicals and pollution, then that's all going to be absorbing straight into your baby's gut and brain as well. So there is a big connection with chemical exposure and those, ADHD and autism as well.
Well, thank you so much, Sandi, for educating all of us on importance of kids' health, all the kids that are just being born, or to all the moms, who are pregnant. I mean, take care of your nutrition, and that's the underlying right, the underlying message here, and take care of your baby's gut health and nutrition, because later on that can manifest itself into some kind of a bigger problems or ailments, right?
Yes, definitely. And one more thing I'll just quickly add in that I think is really important to highlight is I don't think people are sitting down at the table and eating in the right environment anymore. So many kids are eating in front of a screen, a TV, or an iPad. And this is really disconnecting us from being able to digest our food. They're stimulated. They're in that sympathetic nervous system, that kind of fight and flight response. So they're not in the ability to be able to digest and break down their food. So we've really disconnected from sitting down at the dinner table with family, discussing our day, like a lot of traditional cultures do, to giving our kids some toast in front of the TV or even in front of the iPad. So I want to really emphasize that, before going and spending lots of money on practitioners and supplements, maybe just try and do some mindful eating practices at home with your children. So this is really important. Chewing your food, smelling your food, tasting your food.
I think a lot of us do that, right? And today's day and age, we just kind of sit in front and watch the TV, and when we're eating, I mean, at least, and the whole idea of sitting down at the dining table, very few families, not that I've done research or anything, but the very few families do that now, is what I'm saying, right? Because of the time, like people are busy with their times.
And I get that. So, if you can try and make dinner time the time where you all sit down and have a really nice meal together, that's great. Start with that. And it's something that you have to constantly work at, is mindful eating, and it's, chewing your foods. Just getting your kids into those good habits is really good.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much again, Sandi. Mindful eating, making sure you're chewing your food properly, making sure that you're taking the right nutrition and giving the right nutrition to your baby, newborn babies, and to yourself. That's why we brought Sandi. She is an expert on kids' health. She also teaches pediatric health in Australia at a leading university. So hope it helps all of you. With that, thank you so much. I'd like to wrap up this session. Thanks a lot, Sandi.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.